today I am going to be telling you how I actually make my sponges for my wedding cakes, and a few things that I've learned along the way about that. And my hair's dreadful as well, goodness me. Because there have been a couple of questions in the group about, stability of cake and all that kind of stuff. So I thought I'd just go through how I do it and the way that I bake them and that kind of thing. And if it's any use to you, then brilliant. It might be that you have your own way of doing things, which of course is absolutely fine. But I thought I'd share the way that I do it. Oh, Jill's here. Hello, Jill. So we're talking basic recipes. I'm going to talk you through how I actually bake them and tins and all that kind of stuff. And I've also got a very simple PDF that I'll put in the group with some basic sort of amounts and things that if you find useful, then brilliant. So my basic sponge recipe, I'm not going to talk about fruitcakes today, by the way, because very few people want fruitcakes. And actually, I still use Delia's recipe mainly for that. So today I'm just talking about sponge and sort of various permutations of sponge, because most of my flavors, I use the same recipe. There's only a couple. So carrot cake, I have a different recipe, and I'll give you the link for the recipe I use for that. And red velvet, if I do that, I use a different recipe for that. And again, I'll give you the link to the one that I use for that. But most of my other flavors are based on the same sponge mixture with a few sort of tweaks and adaptations and additions and that kind of thing. My basic 6-inch cake. Now these are amounts for 4-inch deep. Okay, she said, hopefully that's about 4 inches deep. As standard now, actually, I do 6 inches deep, but I'll give it to you for 4. And then what I do is I halve it and add another half on to make it 6, if that makes sense. So my basic recipe is, and I base it on the number of eggs, because it's just easier to say it's so many eggs, therefore it's so many of the other bits. So my 6-inch cake, I use 4 eggs. And as with the traditional sponge mixture, I then double the amount. So it's 8 ounces of caster sugar. I use stalk for my margarine. I don't use butter. I found butter too greasy. But stalk, I think it just comes out just right. It's perhaps a little bit more expensive than the supermarket own brands and things, but I've used those and actually find stalk to be the spot on one. So 8 ounces of caster sugar, 8 ounces of stalk. Obviously cream that up. You know how to make a sponge. You cream that up. And then I add 4 eggs. Now, what I do with my eggs is I don't add them straight into the mix. I put them in a bowl, check there's no eggshells in, because often when you're cracking, you get eggshells in there. And then I mix it up with a fork. And then I will add around half of that plus half the flour. And the flour, again, is 8 ounces of flour. But what I do is I turn it into a bit more of a Madeira by putting plain flour in as well. And I put in 1/4 of the amount of plain flour to self-raising. So if it's 8 ounces self-raising, I'll put in 2 ounces of plain. And if it's a chocolate cake, I'll put in 2 ounces of cocoa. So the cocoa substitutes for the plain flour. And then, so I mix up the stalk and the sugar, and then sort of half eggs, half flour, and mix it all in. And I just use my mixer for all of that. I don't do any sort of gentle folding or anything like that. It just goes into my Kenwood and he sorts it all out for me. I've never had an issue. In fact, there are times where I've left it mixing for quite a while, and it's fine every time. I've never overmixed anything. She says, that's famous last words, isn't it? But I do it like that, and I use the paddle mix, the paddle attachment, not the whisk. The whisk I'd use for Swiss meringue buttercream and things like that. But I use the paddle, and that's how I mix up my mixture. So for a 6-inch cake, it's 4 eggs. For an 8-inch cake, it's 8 eggs. And for a 10-inch cake, it's 12 eggs with the same proportions of all the other bits and pieces. So if I'm doing a 6, 8, 10 tier, and it happens to be all the same flavour, which is quite handy if it's all the same flavour, I'll mix up the 6 and the 8 together, because 12 eggs is about what my mixer can cope with. So I'll mix those together and then divide those into the tins, and then do another batch of 12 for the 10-inch cake. Now, when it comes to, oh, hello, Tina. Hello, Melanie. Oh, good question, Melanie. Large eggs. Large. There have been the odd occasion when perhaps I might have run out of large, or the shops haven't had any. So I might have put a couple of medium in. I don't use all medium. But if I'm desperate and I've run out of large, I might put 1 or 2 medium in. But on the whole, large eggs. Good question. Hello, Louise. Hello, my lovely. Now, when it comes to my tins and my preparation, I don't grease anything. No greasing at all. Nothing. No. I don't flour. I don't anything like that. I find the trouble with greasing tins is that it tends to fry the outside a little bit, and I don't like that. No. So what I do is simple enough, as simple as but parchment circle, and I buy my parchment circles ready cut because it saves so much time. Parchment circle in the bottom, then I do a strip of parchment, and I buy the strips. I should have brought the thing up for you to see. I'll put a link in for you. I buy strips of parchment. If you want to do it really cheap, you can just use big parchment roll and cut it, but I'm on to saving time. So I buy the 4-inch deep parchment roll. I roll out enough to go round, and then I fold the bottom up and snip it so that it can curve round. You know what I mean by that, don't you? I put that in, and then I put another parchment circle on top, and then I put my mixture in that. No greasing, no flouring, no nothing. And they come out every time. The other thing that I do, I know some people do this, is I use a baking belt as well, because what you want is you want your sponge to be as flat as possible. You don't want it to dome, because that's wastage. And when you're talking business, you don't want wastage, do you? So you want your sponges to rise as high as possible without that big dome on the top. So I use a baking belt. In fact, I brought a baking belt, didn't think to bring the others. I make my baking belts. This one's a little tired and worn out, but it's basically a length of, let me undo it. It's a length, it's a bit rippy because I've used it so many times, this one. It's a length of, there we go. Length of silver foil. It's folded over and folded over again. Yeah. And then in there, you've got some paper. I've got paper towel. And what you do is you wet that, you make it damp. Then you fold it inside. So I fold it over and fold it over again. Oops. Oh, hang on. Do this like that. Whoops, which gives me that. And then I wrap that round the cake, pin, and I secure it. And that, I truly believe, helps me to get a flatter cake as possible. I also bake at 150. and I bake it long and slow. So most of mine, even a 6-inch, will take up to an hour to bake. But it's worth it because long and slow, and you get as flat as possible without the wastage. And then, of course, you can trim off the top, but you get very little trim cut off with those. Okay, I tried those once. Oh, yeah, it does work, doesn't it, Louise? I swear by them. I don't. Morning, Louise. I don't use those for fruitcakes, because I'm using plain flour for fruitcakes, and they don't dome fruitcakes, do they? They tend to stay flatter. But for sponge cakes, I always use those. So that's sort of the basics of it, really. So I don't grease. I use parchment, and they slide out of the tins. I've got some tins that have got the thingy bottoms. What do you call them? Loose bottomed. That's it. Loose bottom tins. So once I've parchmented it all, once they baked, they cool down. I let them cool in the tin for about 10 minutes. Then I sort of punch them out of the tin, so the loose end, and let them cool down. And once they're cool, I will cling film them. I used to cling film them while they were still warm, but there was a big debate in my big Facebook group about you shouldn't really do that because of bacteria and all that kind of stuff. So I tend to wait until they're cool now. I've never had a problem with wrapping them warm, but I tend to wait until they're cool. And what I generally do is I will do those the day before I want to decorate, crumb coat and fill them, because sponge cakes do settle. They do sort of firm up, but without going dry. So if I'm in desperate needs, I will do it in one day, but I prefer not to. So I'll bake. If I've got a wedding on Saturday, I will usually bake, usually the Thursday, sometimes the Wednesday, but usually the Thursday. And then I've got the Friday to crumb coat and do whatever finish is required, either sugar paste or buttercream finish. But leaving them, at least overnight, wrapped up in cling film, just helps them to settle down. They sort of and they're not so fragile the day after, but they don't go stale. And what I do, and this really helps for the moisture of the cake, is so for a 4-inch high cake, I'll divide the mixture into two. So I've got two 2-inch sponges. Each of those I will then cut in half. So my layers within my tiers are always 1 inch. So if it's a 6-inch cake, it'll have 6 layers in, because then I can do a layer of filling or buttercream, whatever the filling is, in between each one. And it's a really good ratio of cake to buttercream. And it also means that you haven't got to put loads of buttercream in between layers, which of course makes it more liable to slide about. So 1 inch of sponge, layer of buttercream with jam, if necessary, if that's what the cake requires, and then build that up. And say you don't have to have then too much buttercream. I used to find that with 2-inch layers, you'd either have to have so much buttercream that it would be, it would be sliding about, or you'd have less buttercream and you just have most of your mouthful would be sort of dryish cake without any buttercream to sort of moisten it up a bit. So all my cakes are inch sponge, bit of buttercream, inch sponge, bit of, and so on. So that's how I do it. So that's the sort of basics of what I do, and that is for vanilla. Chocolate, what I do with chocolate, I don't use caster sugar. I use either light brown sugar or I might use muscovado sugar. I find that using different sugars for different flavors really enhances the flavors. I used to just use caster sugar for everything, but I've sort of discovered all these different sugars, and now I do different ones. So if I'm doing a salted caramel cake, which I get quite a few requests for, then I use muscovado sugar. If you've never used muscovado sugar, you must try it, because the smell is it's toffee-like, it's caramelly, it's gorgeous. More expensive, of course, but then you just pass that on to the customer. So for salted caramel, I use muscovado sugar. I use a salted caramel flavoring, either Foodie Flavors or Bow flavorings. Either of those I find really, really good. But all the other amounts are exactly the same. If I'm doing a coffee cake, I will also use muscovado sugar, because I think the muscovado really helps to bring out the coffee flavor. So yeah, so think about different sugars. So if your flavoring is needing to be caramelly or toffee, so Biscoff, I don't actually do any Biscoff, but if I did, I would use muscovado sugar, because it will really enhance the caramelly taste. Okay. Yeah, and for chocolate cake, either light brown sugar, muscovado sugar, or even dark muscovado sugar, if I want to go really sort of dark and chocolatey on those. I'll change those depending on my mood, to be honest with you. They all come out gorgeous, so yeah, whatever. But all of those will be at 150. All of those I generally bake with only 2-inch worth of mixture in the tin, because I find that any deeper, you're at risk of overdoing the outside and not doing the inside. I found that that's the sweet spot, sort of roughly sort of 2 inches worth of mixture, 150 in the oven, about an hour. A 10-inch and a 12-inch are going to take much more than an hour. But obviously you do the skewer test and all that kind of stuff, and you know your ovens. So you know how long things will take relatively to others. So that's sort of basically what I do. But I think for me, what's important is that, you know, the inch layer, that really makes a difference, because you've got a lovely ratio of sponge to buttercream then, or ganache, whatever it is you use on the inside. Oh, good, Tina. I'm glad that's useful. But yeah, different sugars. I might write a blog on different sugars, actually, because I think people forget what a choice there is out there and what a difference it can make. When I make chocolate brownies, I don't often make them to sell, actually. I've done a couple of dessert tables with brownies, but actually I make brownies mainly for when I go rehearsing for my play rehearsals. I always take them some brownies, and they go absolutely bananas about them. But my brownies, I use either light brown sugar, or I use muscovado sugar in those, and they just I don't use golden caster sugar at the moment, but I'm considering having a go at doing some cakes with that, because I think golden caster sugar does give that another hint of flavour to it. So yeah, next time you're in the supermarket, go and have a look at all the different sugars and see what, you know, different permutations you can get with those. I've never put demerara in a cake. Demerara for me is just toppings, you know, because it's far too heavy and crunchy to put in a cake. You'd get far too much grit, I think. But say there's the muscovado sugars, the light and dark brown sugars, all those. So have a go. You might, if you don't use those already, then have a go, because they're a bit of a game changer. So those are my basic recipes. For the PDF that I'm going to put in has got 6, 8, and 10 amounts. I might add 20 on the bottom. 12-inch. For 12-inch, 4 inches deep is 20 eggs I use. And I have to do that in 2 lots because my mixer will only take a 12 egg mixture at once. Otherwise it goes so I have to do those in 2 lots. And if I need a 6-inch deep 12-inch cake, then that would be 30 eggs. And I'd have to do that all day, basically, because I'd need to do 3 lots of 10 egg mixtures and then divide it up and so on and so forth. In fact, my 12-inch cakes, I bake 1 inch's worth. So I will do, I will make up. So if it's a 4-inch sponge I'm doing, I'll mix up 20 eggs, but I'll do it in 10 egg lots. And of that 10 egg mix, I'll divide that into 2 tins so that each layer is done separately. Because I found, as I said before, if I do that one too deep, it browns too much on the outside and doesn't bake on the inside. You might find it different for your ovens, but with mine, I prefer to do them separately, and they cook slightly quicker that way as well. You're not sort of constantly going to the oven, are they cooked yet, and poking them with your skewer. So yes, and 12 inch is the biggest my oven can do. I can't do any bigger than that because it won't fit. So those are my proportions. And what I do is it's easy to assume, isn't it, that a 12-inch cake is just going to be double a 6-inch cake. Well, that's not the case at all. If you think of a 6-inch square cake and a 12-inch square cake, actually a 6-inch cake is only a quarter of it, isn't it? And it's sort of similar for round cakes as well. Your 12-inch is far, far, far bigger than just double your 6-inch. It's all to do with maths. See, I love maths. I'm often working, if I get a recipe, and I've done this with my carrot cake recipe, I use Paul Hollywood's carrot cake recipe, but I leave the pecans out. He puts pecans in it, but I leave those out. But I use that one. And that one, if memory serves, is for an 8-inch tin. So what I do is I calculate, very geeky, I calculate if it's, so I had to do an 11-inch carrot cake a couple of weeks ago. So I work out the area of an 8-inch circle, and I work out the area of in fact, I've got it here. I jotted it all down here. Oh no, it's 7-inch. So his recipe is 7-inch. And for an 11-inch, I needed about 2.5 times the mixture because of the size of the different things. So I work it all out via area. Once a primary teacher, always a primary teacher. If you do need some help swapping over amounts and calculating amounts, just shout in the group, because I love doing things like that. I'm a bit of a geek. It really is a case of looking at the area of the cake tin that you're after and increasing or decreasing accordingly. But of course, bearing in mind that you can't really split an egg up very much. So it's all to do with whole eggs as well. But if you need hand changing over recipes and working out how much you need, just shout, because I'm happy to do that because I'm weird. So yeah, so for carrot cake, I use Paul Hollywood's recipe, but without the pecans. I don't put pecans in, and I don't put sultanas in my carrot cake. That's a lovely recipe, actually, because carrot cake generally uses vegetable oil rather than butter or anything like that, and it comes out gorgeous, gorgeous. And with that recipe, actually, I'm not too fussy about the amount of carrots. So it might say, I think the basic recipe is 260 grams of carrots or 230 grams of carrots. I don't sit there and put, little shreds to make it up to 230. If I'm roughly in that ballpark for carrots, because the carrots don't make a difference to the actual chemical balance of the cake, if you like. With the other bits and pieces they do, but the carrot I just put in. I don't go too fussy about that because it never makes a difference. For red velvet, I've used the BBC Good Food recipe for red velvet, and I've also used Jane's Patisserie for red velvet. You have to be quite careful with red velvet commercially because you're limited to the amount of red food colouring you can put in. So I actually don't list red velvet on my flavours anymore. If a couple really want it, then I'll do it. They request it, but I don't put it on my options, mainly for that reason, because it's actually quite difficult to make, in my opinion, a red cake with the limits of colouring that we're allowed to use. I do things like I use raw cocoa, so I use real expensive cocoa powder, which does help to enhance the red colour a little bit. But you do have to be a little bit careful. You can't put too much red food colouring in there. What other flavours? So most of my other flavours are based on a vanilla recipe. So white chocolate and raspberry, I do a lot of white chocolate and raspberry. And generally, if I can remember, I'll look it up in a minute and put it on the PDF. But for every egg, I think I use 30 grams of white chocolate and I use 50 grams of raspberries. It might be the other way around, but then I'll look it up and put it on there. And what I actually do with my white chocolate and raspberry, because I've done so many of these, I always getting asked for these, is the chocolate gets melted. I use Calabash. Is that Calabash? That doesn't sound right, but in the big bags. Calibo. It's Friday morning, I've had a long week. But I use those, the little chips, little white chips. Melt it. I let it cool down a bit because you don't want to put really hot white chocolate in a mix with the eggs and stuff because they go a bit bonkers. So I melt it, let it cool down a bit, and then mix it in. But I don't put the raspberries in yet. What I do is once that mixture is in the tins, I then take the amount of raspberries, I'll squish them up a little bit, and I'll actually swirl them in the middle. And the reason I do that is that I don't want raspberries on the outer edge of the cake, because if you're buttercreaming, crumb coating it, and you've got a big splodgy wet raspberry in the way, that causes a problem with your buttercream. So I put the mix in the tin. I then swirl the raspberries, leaving about an inch around the edge. And I just swirl them around, making sure, and squish the raspberries up a bit, because if you leave them whole, they'll all sink to the bottom. So I squish them up, I mash them up a little bit and swirl it around. But I also use a bit of Foodie Flavors raspberry flavouring, which is just gorgeous. It's real authentic raspberry. I squirt it, just squirt a little bit in, and you can smell the raspberries straight away. It's a really earthy raspberry smell. So I use a little bit of that just to enhance it as well. And that comes out beautifully. And it leaves me with an outer edge that I can crumb coat really easily without, having raspberries in the way, getting squidgy. Oh, hello, Selena. Nice to see you here. What other flavours do I use? Oh, lime and coconut. So anything with lime or lemon, fresh limes, fresh lemons, grate in the zest to the mixture, a little bit of the juice as well. If it's lime and coconut, I've been asked for quite a few lime and coconuts. They seem to be quite popular. I think it's something like I use 40 grams of coconut per egg. I do everything per egg because it's just easier. I think that was the amount I decided on in the end. So desiccated coconut, and I think it was 40 grams per how many eggs I was using for that particular sponge. And that's the amounts I use for that. So there we go. So that is sort of my basic recipe, and a few things that I do along the way when I'm making. I've got the PDF. Hang on, let me see if I can show it to you. I think it's here. Hang on, let me share my screen. I can show you this one. Here it is. Hang on. So this one, so a 6-inch, 8-inch, 10-inch. What I'll do at the bottom, I'll add a few bits for the other sizes. Oh, and I've also put a guide for how much buttercream. I tend to use buttercream rather than ganache, although I might change that next year, because ganache does give you nice sharper edges and smoother sides. But if you're using buttercream, these are the amounts that I use for a filling and crumb coat. If I'm doing a textured buttercream, you know, with the wibbly wobbly scraper, you have to have a lot more. But those are my basics. So 500 grams of sugar paste will cover a 6-inch cake, 4 inches deep. If it's 6 inches, you might need a little bit more. And then I'll put a few bits on the bottom about the other flavors. And once I've done that, I'll put it in the group for you. I hope that's been useful. I say it's really just the way I do it. You know, if you've got ways that you're doing things, just brilliant. If you've got some tips and things that you think, or things that really work for you, do let us know. Do share them. I'm not going to be in the slightest bit offended if someone says, well, this is my recipe and it really works for me. If you want to share your recipes, then please do. If you've got any really good flavors that people ask for, I'm always on the lookout for other flavors. In fact, when I talk to my couples, I'll say, well, this is my basic list, and I'll either email them or show them. I'll say, but if you've got a flavor that you really want, then just let me know, because I love to add new flavors all the time. In fact, one couple, it was one of my September weddings, when they contacted me at the beginning of the year, said, we went on holiday to some, I can't remember where they said they went on holiday, but we had this cinnamon cake, which was utterly divine, and we'd like that for our wedding cake. Can you do a cinnamon cake? So I said, yes, of course I can do a cinnamon cake, she said, frantically Googling cinnamon cake. But I found a really good recipe. And this one actually did use butter, because it needed buttery butter, you know, and obviously cinnamon and various other bits. And I sent them a taster of it, and they said, oh, it was even better than the one we had on holiday. I was like, hooray! But I think that one I had to do an 11-inch version of that. So I had to size up the recipe that I had to make it into an 11-inch. They wanted a big cinnamon cake. But that's the way it is. So yeah, so if you've got any favorite recipes that you're happy to share, then please do. Say the more the merrier, really.